Okay, we're going to move right along here with our discussion of the digestive system by talking about the pancreas. So that's number 22 on your list. So the pancreas is a fairly small organ. It lays right behind your stomach. There's a good picture of that on page 503 in your book. And it's going to run kind of horizontally across your abdomen, right behind the lower portion of the stomach. So it's nestled in right where your stomach hooks into the duodenum or the duodenum of the small intestine. It's kind of lumpy. It's got a texture to it. It's not smooth like the stomach is. And the main function of it is to make certain products. It's an exocrine organ. Make certain products and distribute those where they need to go. So we've already talked about insulin, and we mentioned the glucagon at that time. And those, of course, are going to be important in the uptake of carbohydrates, the sugars that are broken down inside the digestive system. So we kind of talked about that before in another chapter when we talked about insulin and diabetes and all that kind of stuff. But the insulin and the glucagon, those things are actually a small percentage of what the pancreas actually does. Your pancreas mostly makes this pancreatic juice, and in that pancreatic juice is going to be buffers, which are going to change the pH of the chyme as it runs through the rest of your digestive system, and then enzymes. So the chyme in the stomach, of course because of the hydrochloric acid production, is going to be very acidic, and your stomach is set up for that. It's got this mucus layer around it that's going to protect all the cells of the stomach lining from that acid. But throughout the rest of your digestive system, the small intestine and the large intestine can't really have that mucus layer, because that's where all the absorption needs to happen. And if that mucus layer was there, the nutrients and things would not be able to be absorbed from the food very easily. So the pancreas is going to produce this pancreatic juice, and one of the main roles of that is to increase the pH, make the chyme less acidic so that it is not going to be as hard on your intestine cells as it moves through. So there's going to be this duct called the pancreatic duct. And so it's basically a tube that runs from the pancreas and hooks right into the duodenum of the small intestine. So right at the beginning there, it's going to be pumping this pancreatic juice in to change the pH, to make it less acidic. And so the pancreatic juice has a pH of about 8, and by pumping that in, it'll kind of neutralize some of the acid. It's still going to be more acidic than neutral, but it's not going to be as acidic as it was in the stomach, and so it makes it easier for your intestine cells to be able to resist that acid. So enzymes are the other main thing that are produced by the pancreas that are going to help to further digestion, break chemicals down, and get them ready for uptake through the intestinal walls. So the main enzymes are going to be classified based on what they break down. So you've got lipases, which break down lipids. You've got carbohydrases, which break down sugars and carbohydrates. And then you've got proteases, which break down proteins. And there's some nucleases as well. So, I mean, really, ACE, that ending means enzyme. So each enzyme is going to be basically named with that and what they break down. So as far as the control of the secretions, really the main thing you need to know there is that when the chyme goes into the duodenum, then this hormone secretin is released, and that secretin is going to trigger the pancreatic juice to be produced and start flowing down the pancreatic duct. And one of the main parts of that pancreatic juice is something called sodium bicarbonate, which, if you remember, if you've taken chemistry, is just baking soda. So you basically, your body produces the same compound that's in baking soda, and it's a good base. It neutralizes an acid. I wouldn't worry about all the rest of that different types of enzymes and proteases and stuff like that. Just know kind of the main things. Proteases break down proteins, lipases break down lipids, and carbohydrates break down sugars and carbohydrates. Okay, moving on to the liver. The liver is a pretty big organ. It says in the book it's roughly 2.5% of your body weight, so it's got a good chunk to it. It's going to exist kind of on more your right-hand side. It's kind of lobed, so it does start kind of in the middle, but the big chunk of the lobe is towards the right side of your body. And the main thing that the liver does is it's going to take all of the blood that comes from the digestive system around the stomach and the intestines, where the nutrients that have been absorbed from your food get into that blood. It's going to act as kind of a filter for that blood. So all the stuff that's coming out of your food is going to go into the blood, the digestive part of the blood system, the cardiovascular system. But that blood is going to run through the liver before it actually goes out to the body to be able to distribute those nutrients. And so what the liver is going to do is it's going to filter out toxins from that food. This is why, cirrhosis of the liver, as we'll talk about later, is something that can come about from drinking a lot of alcohol, because the alcohol gets filtered out and a lot of it ends up in the liver and can actually destroy cells there if you get too much of it. But the other thing that the liver is going to do is it's going to pull certain nutrients out and then help distribute those as well. So that's kind of the main things. It also produces bile, but we'll get to that in a minute. So on page 504 in your book, you see the shape of the liver. It's got 4 lobes to it. So you got great big lobes kind of on the front side, and those are just called the left and the right lobes. And then on the back, you see the caudate and the quadrate lobes. And those are just going to be kind of little parts of the liver that are, we're not going to really get into the distinction between those, but you should just know that the liver has those 4 lobes. And if you look on page 504, you'll also see the gallbladder, which is considered a distinct organ, even though it's tied to the liver's function, but we'll be talking about the gallbladder kind of on its own in a little bit. So as far as the anatomy goes, that's pretty much all you need to know there. Crap. Okay, now in the liver, in these lobes, you're going to find these tiny little portions of these lobes called lobules. So kind of like in the lungs, we talked about the divisions down to lobules. Here you've got lobules as well. And on page 505, you can see kind of the diagram of those lobules and see how the blood vessels run through. And the blood is an important part of what's going on here, because of course that's where all the nutrients and things are that the toxins from your food that the liver is trying to extract. So anything that has to do with the liver, you'll see the prefix hepato. So hepato means liver, if you remember that from your root functions, or your root terms, I mean. And so the hepatocytes are going to be the actual cells that you'll see in these lobules. And those are going to have some different functions to them as far as uptake of these nutrients and then production of the bile. Now overall, I wouldn't worry too much about the actual breakdown of those lobules. I mean, just kind of look at that picture so you get a feel for how they're arranged as far as the blood vessels and that kind of stuff. But the main thing that we want to kind of look at is this production of bile. So bile is an important fluid that is going to also, along with the pancreatic juice, help to buffer the chyme and make it so that it is less acidic. But it's also going to break down lipids into tiny little pieces so that they're easier to uptake. A lot of lipids, there are some lipids that are water soluble, but most lipids are not. Think about a lipid as an oil. Oil and water don't tend to not mix, and so there's a lot of lipids that are not water soluble. And so this bile is going to mix in and help to kind of separate those liquids. We call it emulsification. It breaks it down in these tiny little pieces and make it so that the enzymes are able to kind of work on them, break those lipids down, and get them absorbed through the small intestine. So the bile production is going to be an important part of what the liver does, and that's going to be tied into the function of the gallbladder, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the bile that is produced in the liver is going to run through something called the common hepatic duct. So that's basically just a tube that's going to collect all the bile from the liver and run it down towards the intestines. But there's kind of a branch there. It can go through from the common hepatic duct, so that's kind of the main tube that comes out of the liver, but then it branches off into the common bile duct and the cystic duct. If it goes through the common bile duct, it's going to go to the... Okay, ignore Manning there. As I was saying, if the bile is going to the intestines, it'll go through the common bile duct, and that goes straight into the duodenum. But it can also run through the cystic duct, which goes into the gallbladder. That's going to be important because the liver can't really make enough bile to keep up with your digestion, so it has to get stored somewhere, and the gallbladder is an important piece to that we'll talk about in a little bit. Moving on to the gallbladder. So the gallbladder it's a muscular organ. It's got muscles in it because it's going to have to squeeze itself, as we'll see in a little bit. It's located right next to the liver, kind of underneath one of the lobes, and it's small, kind of pear-shaped. And it's going to hook into the common hepatic duct through the cystic duct. Okay? And all of that is kind of a network that runs from the liver on one side and the gallbladder down, connects together, and then runs down to the duodenum and runs and squeezes in through there. So the basic thing that the gallbladder does is basically store extra bile. So the liver produces bile continuously. It does ramp up, I guess. It does ramp up its production of bile, but there is kind of a common continuous flow throughout the majority of the day. It can increase that amount, but basically the point is when you get food in your intestines and it needs that bile, if it was just up to the liver, your liver would not be able to keep up terribly well. And so the gallbladder is going to store extra bile. When there's no food that is in your small intestines, then the common hepatic duct, the common bile duct, is going to be closed off right next to the duodenum. There is a bunch of muscles there called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. So it's kind of interesting here, the pancreatic duct and the common bile duct hook together and run through a common tube straight into the small intestine at the duodenum. And so right around there, there's a sphincter muscle that will clamp that off and make it so that stuff from the pancreas and the liver gallbladder can't run in. And when that backs up, the bile backs up in that tube through the common bile duct. It'll back up, and then it'll back up into the gallbladder. So if you imagine the bile running from the liver, it runs down, it tries to go into the duodenum, but that sphincter is closed, and so it'll back up the tube, and it's kind of like an overflow on the side of the liver so that extra bile gets stored up in that gallbladder, so that when the hepatopancreatic sphincter opens up and lets that bile through, then there's enough bile that can actually run into the small intestine through there. There's a good picture of this, if it's hard to picture in your mind, on page 507. It shows how those things are related to each other. The arrival of chyme into the small intestine is going to produce CCK. So we talked about CCK, that hormone, a little bit before, and that CCK is then going to stimulate the hepatopancreatic sphincter to open up and let the stuff out of the pancreas and and the gallbladder slash liver. So both the pancreas and the liver are going to, or the bile from the liver and the gallbladder are going to be controlled by that release of the CCK, that one hormone. And of course, because that is stimulated by the chyme arriving into the pancreas or the duodenum, the small intestine, as we talked about before, then basically until food gets from your stomach into the small intestine, that stuff's not going to be running in there. But once the food gets there, the chyme, the mixture of the food and the acids and everything, then that opens up, and the secretions from the pancreas and the gallbladder are able to kind of modify the pH of that chyme, make it so that it's not going to irritate your the lining of your intestines, and help break stuff down as well. One thing about the gallbladder, though, when that bile gets backed up into the gallbladder will actually absorb a lot of the water out of it and kind of concentrate the bile and make it more potent. So it'll make it so that as it runs in there, it has more of an effect on the chyme than it would in its diluted form straight from the liver. So it does modify the bile a little bit. The thing is, it can concentrate it a little bit too much. And if you take a liquid and remove too much of the water and concentrate it, if you've ever made rock candy, what you do is you have that mixture of sugar and water, and as you remove some of the water, then the water can't hold as much of the sugar, and it'll precipitate out and form the rock candy. Well, in this case, the same thing is happening, but you get a gallstone. So gallstones form when the bile in the gallbladder gets too concentrated, so that it can't keep it all in solution, and some of it forms a solid. And then those gallstones can be painful to pass. I believe it's not as common as kidney stones, which we'll talk about when we do the urinary system, but it is definitely something that can happen, and it can be painful. So that is really the main thing, main stuff that you need to know about the gallbladder. Yeah, I don't think we need to worry about too much else there. The gallbladder is pretty. Oh, I guess the one other thing that I'll talk about real quick is that as I said before, it is a muscular structure, and so when the pancreatic sphincter releases and lets that bile out, the gallbladder actually will contract and squeeze the bile out into the intestines. So that pretty much wraps up the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas. Those are the things we talked about today. So that's 22 through 25 on your sheet. Tomorrow we'll go through 26 through 28. We'll talk about the large intestine, the different sections, what happens in the large intestine, and we'll talk about defecation.
What do you have for hours?